Okay, we're going to talk about complex numbers, powers of I, operations with complex numbers, simplifying, that sort of thing. And we've practiced some of this. So the standard form how to write complex numbers is just like this, A plus BI. So if you ended up simplifying a problem and you had negative 6i plus 12, you would just rewrite that as 12 subtract 6i. All right, so we always tend to want to write things in standard form. This would be how you do it. Now, the powers of I, very, very important skill and thing to know in some parts of math. You'll need to know it here. So the square root of -1 is equal to I. That's where we get the I from, right? So I to the first is just equal to I. Well, I squared, well, let's think about that. If you take the square root of -1 times the square root of -1, what do you get? Yes, -1. And so think about that. I squared, square root of -1 times the square root of -1 is, in fact, -1. Okay. I cubed, well, let's think about this. If I to the first is I, and I squared, I to the first times I squared is equal I cubed, right? Well, I to the first is I squared is -1. -1 times I is just -I. All right? And then I to the fourth is I squared times I squared. Or you could do I cubed times I to the first. That would be fine too. Well, I squared times I squared. Well, I squared is -1 times -1 is 1. Let's look at I cubed. I cubed is -I. I to the first is I. And -I times I is -I squared. Sorry, I paused there for a second. I squared is -1. The opposite of -1 is +1. That's why I tend to go to this. I squared times I squared is the same as I to the fourth, because -1 times -1 is just easier to simplify quickly. But here's the task. Good idea to memorize those things. I mean, it's easy enough to arrive at them. So if you're not somebody who memorizes very easily, you might want to especially focus on I squared is equal to -1 and I to the first, because then you can just use the powers of exponents to arrive at the other. All right, so now simplifying complex numbers. Well, if we're dividing, we don't want an irrational number, or a non-real number in the denominator. So the way to get rid of that is go ahead and multiply top and bottom by I. We don't have to multiply top and bottom by 5 because 5 is real. I is the imaginary piece, or the complex piece. And so then what do we have? 5i times 5 is 5i squared. Well, I squared is -1. So we have 5 times -1, which is -5. And in the numerator, we just 4 times I is 4i. And to simplify, we don't want to leave this negative sign down there. So it just simplifies to -4i over 5. And if we are writing this in standard form, you would write it as 0 subtract 4i over 5. That would be one way you could do it. Although most of the time we're not going to write the 0. But this would be standard form. All right, so let's come over here and look at one where you've got a monomial. Monomial means one term over a binomial, two terms. And remember, when we have a complex number in the denominator, we use the conjugate method. We multiply by the conjugate. So 5 over 2 subtract 3i. The conjugate would be 2 plus 3i. And then remember the beauty of multiplying by the conjugate. You're going to, here, let me do, multiply the first times the first. So 2 times 2. Negative times a positive is a negative. And then you're going to multiply the second times the second. So 3i times 3i. And yet we're still going to do the numerator. Well, in fact, since this is a monomial, 5 times 5 is 25. So I'll go ahead and do that. And then you're going to simplify that further. So we have 25 in the numerator. 2 times 2 is 4. Subtract. Well, 3 times 3 is 9. I times I is negative 1. A negative times a negative is a positive. 4 plus 9 is 13. So it simplifies to 25 over 13. Now when we have a binomial divided by a binomial, again, we're going to use the conjugate method. So this would be 3 subtract 4i. And since I already have it written down, so again, we multiply the first times the first in the denominator. 1 times 1 is 1. Positive times a negative is a negative. 4i times 4i is 16i squared. And then you're going to simplify the I squared to negative 1. A negative times a negative is a positive. 1 plus 16 is 17. And in the numerator, you're just going to do that double distributive. So here we have 1 times 1 is 1. 1 times negative 4i is negative 4i. Anyway, you keep going with that. And then notice these two are alike. So that simplifies to negative 6i. Negative 2i times negative 4i is positive 8i squared. Well, I squared simplifies to negative 1. 8 times negative 1 is negative 8, plus 1 is negative 7. So it simplifies to this, but if we want to write it in standard form, we go ahead and break out. Remember, when two things have the same denominator, it can be rewritten as two separate fractions, and that would be in standard form. And I think that is it for this one.